Did you want to do a quick roll call? I'll call the meeting to order, everyone. Did you want to do a quick roll call?
No, I don't think it's necessary.
Okay, good. Welcome, everybody. A couple of things I want to say, then I'll turn it over to Bill, and then we can, as always, speak through this. I thank you all for coming. I think we have most all the people here. I don't see Senator Gibbons, or I don't see President Capelouto. I do see Dr. Brown, Dr. Caboni, Dr. Ferguson, Dr. McFadden, Dr. Morgan, Chair Tipton. Looks like Angie Martin may be joining for Dr. Capelouto. Dr. Johnson's here. So I think we have almost everybody but Senator Gibbons, it looks like. John Hicks, good to see you, my friend. So we're going to go get started. A couple things I want to say, then there's a lot to discuss. We're going to give you a lot of material once again. It would behoove us to have the kind of deep conversations that we need to as we go through this. My hope is, although we were scheduled all year, my hope is that somehow we'll derive at some conclusions sooner rather than later. To be able then to discuss with the governor's office and others what our hopes are for our budgetary year. Representative Tipton, I know you all are very anxious to get some of this material to you. So we're going to go get started, but I want you to once again feel free to kind of interject as we go through all of this material. Bill, I'm just going to turn it over to you if I could.
Thank you, Chair Thompson. Welcome work group members this afternoon. Glad to have you on the call. What we're going to cover today is a set of responses that CPE staff put together to essentially the same survey that we sent out to the campuses. We did add one additional question about what outcomes were policymakers expecting from the adoption of the performance funding models. But other than that, it's the same three questions that this working group is charged to answer over the course of the next 6 to 7 months. Is the funding model, or has the funding model functioned as expected? Were there any unintended consequences? What, if any, recommended adjustments are the campuses or CPE staff suggesting? We're then going to cover the university model. We will have combined both the CPE staff recommended adjustments with the university recommended adjustments. We're not going to go through those in any detail. Work group members can read through those on your own. We've already presented you with the recommended adjustments at our last meetings from the campuses. And so what we're going to try to focus on after about 15 minutes of going through those CPE survey responses is getting right to those discussion items. KCTCS is in a little bit different situation than the universities. The central office staff has already worked with their 16 community and technical college presidents to come up with what they believe is close to a consensus set of recommended adjustments. And so we're going to reserve 15 minutes for them near the end of the meeting today to go through some of those adjustments with the working group. But with that, that's what we plan to cover today. Let's go ahead and jump right in. In terms of CPE survey responses, I said a minute ago, we added a question, and you can see it there, that first bullet: what outcomes do policymakers expect to achieve from adopting the funding model? We've got 3 or 4 slides that address that question. In what ways has the funding model functioned as expected? We also added onto that question, were there any unexpected outcomes? Because we have had a couple of those. We'll cover those here in a minute. Have there been any unintended consequences? CPE staff identified 2 unintended consequences. And then what would be the adjustments that CPE staff would recommend to the funding model? And I should say right at the outset, we're going to be talking throughout this presentation until we get to the KCTCS slides about the university funding model. So what were the expected outcomes? We looked at the report of the original working group back in 2016. We looked at council agenda items, and from a review of those documents, here's the list of expected outcomes for the adoption of the funding model. We wanted it to address shortcomings of the previous funding method. We wanted it to rectify some funding disparities that had developed over time, primarily in the comprehensive sector. And most importantly, we wanted to accelerate progress toward attainment of state goals. And that included some specific goals for the model itself, but then also the Kentucky's North Star, the 60 by 30 college attainment goal. I think most of you have seen this slide before, so I'm not going to go through it in too much detail. We essentially used a base plus, base minus approach to distribute funds to our campuses for about a decade. That approach failed to recognize changes in enrollment, program mix, or student outcomes, and there was no link between funding and state goals or outcomes produced. You've seen this as well. This slide is from 2016. It shows net general fund appropriations per FTE student for the comprehensive universities, excluding KSU. And as you can see in the graph, back in 2016, the per student funding gap between Northern and Moorhead was a little over $1,500. And it would have taken Northern a little over $10 million to reach the median, which was the same level of funding per student that Eastern Kentucky University had at $5,029 per student. In terms of the model specific goals for the university funding model, and I went back to that report of the Post-Secondary Education Working Group that was submitted to the governor and the General Assembly December 1st, 2016. And this was the list of goals specifically that the university model was intended to achieve. And there's a separate list of goals in that report for KCTCS institutions. But at any rate, increased retention and progression of students toward timely bachelor's degree completion, increased number of bachelor's degrees earned by all types of students, grow the number of bachelor's degrees in STEM plus H fields, and enclose achievement gaps by growing the number of bachelor's degrees earned by low income and minority students. So obviously there was a lot of focus on bachelor's degrees and bachelor's degrees of different types. I think everyone's familiar with Kentucky's 60 by 30 goal, raise the percentage of working age adults with a high quality post-secondary degree or certificate to 60% by the year 2030. So what we want to look at now is how did we do in terms of meeting those expectations of policymakers. And I think we can say overall that the funding model has operated as expected. You're going to see in a minute that the shortcomings of that previous base plus base minus approach have been addressed. Most of the funding disparities among institutions have been rectified. We're making great progress in terms of total bachelor's degrees awarded, STEM plus H and URM bachelor's degrees. Kentucky is a leader, one of the leaders in the nation in closing achievement gaps. And President Thompson has said this many times, that we're doing it by expanding opportunity and access, but we're also growing the number of degrees earned by our underrepresented minority students. And probably most importantly, the state is on track to achieve its 60 by 30 attainment goal. And I know President Thompson is going to want to touch on both of those here in just a moment. Again, quickly, in terms of addressing the shortcomings of the previous method, we're no longer distributing money based on historical share, but on outcomes produced. The new funding model does take into account changes in enrollment, program mix, and degrees awarded. And there are financial incentives for student progression and completion. You've seen this slide, I believe, at our last meeting. So as expected, the funding disparities that had developed over time leading up to 2016, for the most part, have been rectified. As you can see, between 2017, represented by the blue bars in this graph to the right, and 2023, the red bars in the graph to the right. And this is state funds for educating students per full-time equivalent student, by the way. So this is funding per student. But that funding gap between Moorhead and Northern has narrowed from $1,353 to $324 per student. And you can see, other than Kentucky State University, if you compare Eastern and Moorhead and Murray and Northern and Western, for the most part, those institutions have very similar funding per student in the range of $5,700 through about $6,000 per student. I think this is what President Thompson and council staff and the institution should be the most proud of. We've been making great strides in terms of our degree production. The table that you see on the bottom half of this page has total bachelor's degrees produced, STEM plus H bachelor's degrees, and URM bachelor's degrees produced by our public four-year universities. And you can see that since 2014, total bachelor's degrees have grown by 8% overall, STEM plus H field bachelor's degrees 28%, and awards to underrepresented minority students have grown by 38%. That is some pretty significant percent increases for STEM and URM. Do you want to make any comments at this point, President Thompson?
Just one quick comment. I know we're kind of repeating some of the things you already know, but we wanted to give you just a summation in the sense of the word. Have we been successful at the levels of comparative are doing similar things? Well, two things. One is you probably saw the data where Kentucky now is number 2 in the nation, an increase in completion. We're proud of that. Rhode Island is the only state that beat us, and that's because they transported the 24 people that lived there who already had an education. That's a joke, by the way. I mean, there's more than 24. But the item that I want to point to is that we're starting off with significant gaps. And some of you campuses could want to jump in here. We know that when we're working with our low-income students, when we're working with our URM students and others, it really takes more dedicated dollars, Bill, to do those wraparound services so they can compete academically. And that's the way we measure equity, by the way. It's allowing anyone who's behind their abilities to compete, allow them to have the inputs that they need to get where they need to go. So what we see here is that our campuses, they did the behavioral change, if you want to call it that, to really put dollars into those wraparound services, those academic services that focus on truly low affordability and so on. So all of those elements that's not stated here with those inputs are what these outputs show. So we are closing gaps with our underrepresented population as fast or faster than every other state, and I'm proud of that. We also are showing that we're making significant strides in our STEM plus, and overall, obviously, in all of their efforts. So we haven't brought anyone else down. What these numbers don't show, just for those who are not in higher ed with us, most of our four-year institutions are at an 80% retention rate and closing gaps there. We've increased our retention rates in our two-year system. We've also actually increased our graduation rates. So we not only have produced these degree attained elements that you're seeing, but we also did all of those indicators that goes around whether or not we are doing those items that we need to do within higher education to make sure that all of our students have a chance to compete in our economic system here in Kentucky. So these numbers don't show those pieces, but I just wanted to point out that's what has had to happen in order to make these percent increases take place. Thanks, Bill.
Thank you, President Thompson. And I know you might have some comments about this next slide as well. we're making really good progress toward our 60 by 30 attainment goal. These are some very recent numbers that were put together by CPE data and advanced analytics team. But as you can see in the graph on the right, between 2017 and 2021, college attainment in Kentucky grew by 4 percentage points. And that's some pretty significant growth in a relatively short time frame. And a lot of that growth has been due to increases in bachelor's degrees produced and also graduate and professional degrees. But now it also includes in-migration of people with bachelor's degrees or graduate and professional degrees. But that's where we're seeing the most percentage points of growth is in those areas. And of course, most importantly, we are on track to reach that 60 by 30 attainment goal if we keep going at the same rate we're going over this 5-year period. Any comments, President Thompson?
Just one last one. We won't take up all the time with this, but please understand we had COVID in here. We're one of the very few states that actually put a positive outcome coming out of COVID. That's because the momentum was going. We also actually had decreased enrollment. And our indicators, leading indicators show that that's probably going to continue to take place unless we do some really heavy, good work from higher ed as well as with our K-12 partners to increase those. So we are on track to reach our 60 by 30. And that to me is a good indication that we can put to that economic output to keep the economy going strong if we continue along this route.
Aaron, can we get that disaggregated by how much was from our growth versus how much was from in-migration of those with degrees? I'm just curious.
We can work with KY Stats and get that. So this comes out of our data analytics shop and KY Stats. So we have that kind of power in Kentucky that many other states don't have. By the way, let me point that when you look at national ways of measuring this, they use the Georgetown work, and many of those are assumptions that they make on things like credentials and so on. So here, we don't use assumptions, we use real people. We have the ability to know every single person in the state and what they're offering. So these are enumerated data. So just to let you know, this isn't a guess or a set of assumptions to derive, Secretary Hicks, at an outcome. These are real people that we can measure making however much money they're making in the state. So we can, Tim, to answer your question.
And State Budget Director Hicks, I saw your note pop up on the screen asking for the number included in that working age population, and we can provide those numbers as well. So as I indicated at the outset, there are 2 areas where the funding model has not worked as intended. This is not an unintended consequence, but it's an area where the funding model has not functioned as we hoped that it would. One is the number of students reaching 30 credit hours and 60 credit hour progression thresholds. Those numbers have not increased since we adopted the performance funding models. And a lot of that had to do, as President Thompson indicated, with declining enrollment over that time period. But we're also not seeing very much progress in terms of bachelor's degrees awarded to low income students. And we would have expected growth there, just like we've seen growth in STEM plus H degrees and underrepresented minority degrees. But here are the numbers in terms of 30, 60, and 90 credit hours earned in terms of student progression. As you can see at the 30 credit hour level, between 2014 and 2021, we're down 17%. Students at the 60 credit hour threshold down 9%. And slow growth even in the 90 credit hour threshold with a 3% increase. So that is not what we would have expected 6 years ago when the model was adopted. But as we said, we also would not have expected 6 years ago the kinds of enrollment declines that we've seen over this same time period. And that's having a direct impact on the student progression, especially at the 30 and 60 credit hour levels. As I said, another area we failed to make progress in was low income degree attainment. Between 2014 and 2021, the number of low income students decreased by 106 or 1%. And that's despite having a premium included in the model to reward the growth in low income degrees. But I will point out, if you look at the table to the right, those numbers highlighted in yellow, you can see that the low income degree premium was $1,566 per weighted degree produced. The STEM plus H premium was $2,610 per weighted degree produced in STEM fields. And that minority student premium, underrepresented minority student premium, over $6,000. And those are cumulative. Those are added for every bachelor's degree produced. The institutions, for every weighted bachelor's degree produced, the institutions receive $2,192 per bachelor's degree. But if that bachelor's degree is earned by an underrepresented minority student, the institution not only receives $2,192, they receive an additional premium of $6,052 per underrepresented minority degree awarded, for a total of $8,244 awarded for an undergraduate degree awarded to an underrepresented minority. That's a 3.8 multiple above a bachelor's degree awarded to a non-minority student. But as I said earlier, this is one reason CPE staff is recommending that we increase that premium for the low-income student bachelor's degrees earned. We think if we put a little bit more money in that pool, that perhaps institutions will be able to move the needle a little bit in terms of producing more low-income bachelor's degrees.
Bill, I just want to say one thing, by the way, for just to juxtapose this to the value proposition of higher education and that direct correlation to a thriving economy. What we know is that for every dollar the state has put in to a student, if you will, in Kentucky, for the benefit of the state is a $67 return. So, so you have to understand that every one of these outputs that we're talking about is a return on investment from a pure dollar amount. If you think about the dollars that we spend in prisons and Medicaid and a variety of other places, y'all have heard me give this speech one too many times now, I get it. But I just want to point out the value of this in that value proposition of higher education. For every dollar, think about the dollars you're spending in prisons and Medicaid, and the biggest direct correlation between those that are in that spot is a lack of a college credential, right? Or and anything beyond college, beyond high school, and we could be talking about an apprenticeship too, and so on. But the point I'm trying to make here is that you have to think about these outputs with also the direct outputs that is beneficial to the state. And yes, I'm saying this particularly for Representative Tipton and Secretary Hicks. I don't see Senator Gibbons on. So these dollars to put into the performance funding pool and other items, Bob Jackson, has a bigger output for the state. And so I just wanted to make sure that we understood those correlations.
Thank you, President Thompson. Again, as I mentioned earlier, CPE staff identified 2 cases where the funding model resulted in unintended consequences, and that's primarily due to external circumstances that I'll discuss here in a moment. But the first one was lack of funding during the early years of implementation. And what that did, it resulted in a redistribution of base funds among institutions, but it also slowed progress in moving campus funding toward funding parity. The second area that we identified was the use of the degree efficiency index to weight the number of bachelor's degrees produced. That did not operate as intended due to declining enrollment at most of our institutions. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second as well. Back in 2016, when the original working group developed the funding model for the public universities and the model for KCTCS, I don't think any of those working group members anticipated how long it would take for the state to be able to start reinvesting in higher education again. In other words, those budgetary constraints extended for many more years than most expected. And so as a consequence of that, during the first 4 years that we implemented this funding model, it was done so with no new funding from the state. And you can see that in the chart to the right, the column highlighted in yellow. There was no state funding for the first 4 years, but you can see that the institution contribution starting in year 0 and going through year 3, the institutions had either a carve out of 5% in that first year, year 0, excluding KSU, that was put into the performance fund, or they had a 1% or a 2% stop loss carve out in subsequent years. And so the main funding that was being distributed by the funding model in those first 4 years was funding that had been contributed by the institutions. And that's what I mean. It resulted in a redistribution of base funding among institutions. And so none of us at the time we adopted the model in 2016 anticipated that that would be the case. But, you know, I want to commend the General Assembly for years 4 and 5, beginning to reinvest again in higher education, especially in year 5. 80 million new dollars added to the 17.3 million that was already in the performance fund. That has allowed us in 2022-23 to get to the point that I'll call temporary funding parity among, I'll go ahead and say 7 institutions, because Morehead is so close, even though they did not receive funding in the current year distribution, that $97 million essentially wiped out all but about 278,000 of the hold harmless at Morehead. So they're very close to the funding parity with the other 6 institutions. So really at this point, it's just KSU that is the primary outlier. But at any rate, that lack of funding up until year 5 has slowed our progress toward achieving funding parity. And once you achieve that funding parity, every institution would begin receiving larger distributions or a larger share of any available funds from the performance fund going forward.
Hey, Bill,
Yes.
just, and this is maybe not germane here, but you have a 0 on that slide, but in fact, there were some cuts across the sector during that period of time. So, and some of us had to wrestle with the pension related issue during that period of time, which has consumed some significant public support for, you know, that mandated obligation. And so I think you're right that it has exasperated the issues in the early years of the model. So,
and you're absolutely right, President McFadden. Those zeros under state funding pertain to the state funding that was appropriated to the performance pool, and it does not reflect cuts to the institutions that occurred during that time period or the mandated increases in pension contributions that a number of our comprehensive institutions and KCTCS had to deal with during that time period. So thank you for pointing that out. In terms of the degree efficiency index, in 2016, the working group agreed to weight bachelor's degrees produced using an index of each institution's degrees per 100 FTE students divided by the sector average. And so if you were being more efficient than the sector average, that would increase your number of bachelor's degrees produced by that weighting. If you were less efficient than the sector average, it would reduce the number of degrees counted in the funding model. What we did not anticipate, or the working group did not anticipate at that time, was 5 or 6 years of fairly consistent enrollment declines at a number of our institutions. In fact, at most of our institutions. And so that resulted in sort of a perverse outcome. And that outcome is, you can see that in the third bullet, that basically the index is rewarding institutions that are experiencing declining enrollment. Because as their FTE goes down rapidly, it's making it look like the degrees that they are producing are being produced much more efficiently. And so it's increasing their degree production numbers because of that index in relation to the sector average. And at the same time, those with growing enrollment are being penalized because it's reducing their degree production numbers. And, you know, CPE staff and one or two of the institutions have pointed this out as well, that really does run counter to most of the growth-oriented goals that are included in this funding model. And so that's, you'll see in a minute, one of our recommendations is to do away with that index. Well, and here's the slide. So here are our CPE staff's recommended changes to the model. We think it's important to provide a larger financial incentive for institutions to enroll, progress, and award degrees to low-income students. We need to start focusing on adult learners. You know, we're on track to achieve that 60 by 30 goal, but if we want to make sure that we're going to get there, we need to start you know, getting adult learners back into the system, getting them to some credential or degree, and that's going to help us to achieve that 60 by 30 goal. We would like to add a new workforce success metric. We're going to work with Leslie Sizemore and her team to develop some of the specifics around that metric and bring it back to you at a later meeting. I've already mentioned eliminating the efficiency weighting in the bachelor's degree metric. And then lastly, we want to provide a larger small school adjustment for Kentucky State University and for Morehead State University. And this is something that we had recommended 3 years ago. And had we done it 3 years ago, KSU and Morehead would have been in a much better position over the past 3 years to get some funding out of each of the distributions that were appropriated to the performance fund over that time period. And then lastly, we're recommending that the working group consider establishing a new funding floor. 3 years ago, the working group recommended, and it was codified in statute, that a funding floor 2021 was established, and that then any funding appropriated to the performance pool from that point forward, any distributions would be non-recurring to the institutions that earn those funds, but would be recurring to the performance fund. And so what we're suggesting is, and a couple of other institutions, KCTCS, UK, others have made this proposal, and we're suggesting the same thing, is that we reset that funding floor for 2024. So those are our recommendations. Those recommendations have been incorporated into the list that you're about to see, and I'm not going to go through these. You've already seen all of the suggested changes from the institutions. We've added CPE suggested changes to this list. We tried to categorize them according to some categories that make sense: recurring funds, funding outside the model, the formula share approach. Several institutions have said they want us to consider and discuss maybe moving to 3 models instead of 2. And that's something we'll take up at our next meeting. Several, or at least a couple of institutions have said they want to raise, excuse me, this is the sector weighting, not non-resident student weighting. They would like to eliminate the sector weighting on FTE students or eliminate the sector weighting on degree metrics. Some institutions have said we need to eliminate the small school adjustment. CPE staff is saying, no, we need to keep the small school adjustment and increase it for KSU and Morehead. There have been some suggestions about mandated programs, low income degree weighting. We've already mentioned that CPE staff feels like we need to increase that financial incentive to produce more degrees earned by low income students. Here's the non-resident weighting. We've got 2 institutions that have proposed increasing the weighting in the earned credit hour component for non-resident students. Murray has suggested that we raise it from 5 to 1, which would be the same as resident students. So that's something that this working group needs to discuss and make a decision about. Several institutions have said, let's don't just focus on bachelor's degrees, let's focus on graduate degrees as well. So that's another topic that we can take up in coming weeks and months. We've already talked about the degree efficiency weighting and the perverse incentive that provides. And then lastly, there are several new metrics that have been suggested by institutions and or by CPE. So this is the point of the program where we want to get the work group members involved and have some discussion. And here are the three main questions that we would like over the next hour to an hour and 15 minutes for this group to discuss. First of all, is there a consensus among working group members to recommend that earned performance funds be made recurring to the institutions that earn those funds? Another way to say that is there a consensus to establish a new funding floor 2024, just like we established a funding floor back in 2021? Do work group members support the idea of using a portion of performance funds to provide base allocations outside the model? And we've had several suggestions there. Murray, I believe, Moorhead recommended distributing 1/3 of new money on a proportionate basis. Then they came back and said, show us a scenario of distributing 5% of each institution's adjusted net general fund base, and then distribute the rest of the money using the existing model. Murray State University suggested distributing a portion of available funds to the base of each institution and distributing the remainder using formula share. We've run scenarios for most of these options, and we provided some of those at our last meeting, but we're providing them again today. And then lastly, do work group members support the proposal to use formula share percentages to distribute some portion or all of the performance funds? And we'll talk a little bit about what do we mean by formula share percentages here in a few minutes. But let's start with that question number one. Is there consensus to make earned performance funds recurring to the institutions that earn those funds? And so here's a slide that basically shows what is being proposed and what is the impact. To make funds from the performance fund recurring, that can only be done every other year, and it would coincide with the start of a new biennial budget. Earned funds could be in the second year of the biennium, could be added to the base funds, and then there would be a new beginning base to start the first year of the new biennium. That would entail a request for the General Assembly to add dollars back to the performance fund. Otherwise, you would not have any dollars in that performance pool. In terms of the impact, it would allow institutions to use their earned funds for recurring expenses. And I believe it was UK that said, unless funds are periodically made recurring, we can't plan for their long-term use. And so that this proposal would address that. Also, in terms of impact, the model would operate as intended. It would continue to reflect changes in outcomes produced, and it would continue to address funding disparities over time. And I'm going to stop talking. Here is that scenario where the earned funds become recurring to the base. And as you may recall, that first column of numbers is the actual distribution for the current year, the 2022-23 distribution from the performance fund. There was $97 million in total in that performance fund, but the university share of that total was $75.8 million. Those three columns in the center of this table show that we're taking the adjusted net general fund in the current year. We're adding the 2022-23 distribution, that's $75.8 million. We're adding that to that adjusted net general fund. And then you can see in the third column, the hypothetical 2023-24 adjusted net general fund. Now, if we use that as a starting point and run the model in the normal way, what would the hypothetical 2023-24 funding distribution look like of that same $75,793,300? And then what's that dollar difference? And as you can see, UK would have 30.9 million added to their base so that their new hypothetical base would be 215 million. Northern would have 11.4 million added to their base. Their new base would be 62.3 million. Because you added those funds to the base, you've now moved all of the institutions. You've taken that temporary funding parity and you've moved it to permanent funding parity. So now the next time you run the model, it becomes a distribution where other institutions like Eastern and Moorhead and Murray and Western actually end up earning more funding because now all of the institutions are closer to that funding parity number. So I'm going to stop talking there and turn it over to you, President Thompson, to facilitate the discussion here.
Thank you, Bill. Let me, first of all, we just gave you a whole lot of information, but it boils down to a couple of real fast points. One is we are recommending in some fashion or form for some money to be in some form, no matter what we end up on the amount, to be recurring. And that's an important part to this conversation, simply because we've got to have a better system. And I'm looking at this from a statewide perspective and not from each individual perspective. So that's where I'm talking from here. We have mitigated tuition, but we also know that your inflation has gone up tremendously. We also know that there's been no money going to the base for a while. So we know you have to have dollars going to the base for us to continue to do some of this work that we're doing. So that's one thing. What Bill has put forth is one way of doing that. And it keeps the model still in place to do what the model was designed to do. But there'll be a couple other examples that you'll get here to do that. So from a CPE perspective, we are clearly recommending that dollars go to the base from this point forward. And we have tons of evidence, as you already see, that backs that up. So I think that's the discussion. Number one, is that something we all agree on? Number two, Bill wants you to look at this model he proposed as a direction to make that happen. And so that's the other piece of the discussion.
Dr. Thompson, this is Jay Morgan. Just for a clarifier on funds to the base, which is not necessarily a bad model, so I want to speak generally in favor of it. As a clarifier for you or Dr. Payne, does that assume that the 75 million in the state higher ed appropriation becomes consistent and recurring? And does that potentially grow over time as the model for the base, the recurring base begins to move a little bit?
I'll let Bill answer it in his great detail, but the answer is yes. It assumes that the state will continue to invest in higher education, but it will also assumes that you have to still perform to get the dollars, right? I mean, so it assumes both of those markers. There could be a time, without a doubt, Dr. Morgan, that the state doesn't invest in higher education. At that point in time, then there will be no money going, obviously, to the base with this model. So hopefully I'm answering the question at a macro level. Bill, tell me what I said wrong.
Let me unmute here. You didn't say anything wrong, and I think you hit the nail on the head, President Thompson. What the General Assembly did in 2022, and especially what they did in 2023, they gave us a little over $17 million in the performance fund in 22, and they added $80 million to that in 23. So they've begun to reinvest in higher education. And so that was very much needed after about 11 budget cuts over a 13-year span leading up to that 2022 reinvestment. But what is needed from this point forward is sustained and growing investment so that institutions can address those, inflationary cost increases that occur every year. And many of those cost increases, as you know, are recurring cost increases, and especially in 2022, the highest over a 20-year span in the higher education price index, 5.2% increase in a market basket of goods that are purchased by higher education institutions. The previous high had been around 3% in any one year, and we expect that those inflationary cost increases to be even higher in the current year. And if you don't provide that sustained funding and growing funding moving forward in time, as those costs go up, it puts increasing pressure on institutional budgets. And you've got a choice, raise tuition and fees if the council will allow it under the caps, or cut expenses. And many of our institutions, I know UK and U of L are not only a national market, but international market for faculty, and our comprehensive institutions are in a national and especially or certainly a regional market for trying to retain good faculty and staff. If you don't provide that sustained growing funding, you run the risk of compromising, academic quality, or conversely, you diminish the ability of the institutions to maintain affordability for students and families. So we need those growing funds. And currently, by statute, the performance fund and the performance funding model is the mechanism by which we would add additional operating funds for our institutions. And so what we're doing, and this was done, I've got a copy of the statute in front of me right here. This was done 3 years ago, where the General Assembly recognized that there was a priority for state general fund appropriations for the post-secondary institutions, and that the priority should be the funding floor for those institutions over new appropriations to the performance fund. Funding floor, defined by the General Assembly, means an institution's fiscal year 2021 general fund appropriation plus any fiscal year 2021 distribution from the performance fund minus debt service and appropriations for mandated programs in those years. So basically, 3 years ago, what the working group recommended and what was codified in statute was establishing a funding floor called the Funding Floor 2021. And any earned funds, performance funds in 2021 were added to the regular appropriations for each institutions in those same year, and that became the funding floor. And then, the General Assembly added dollars from that point forward in the performance fund as resources allowed. And of course, in that first year following that change in statute, it was another campus carve out, but then in the second year it was 17 million, and then in the current year 97 million. So resetting the floor does not in any way restrict or require the General Assembly to provide those additional performance funds. It's basically saying, let's add those dollars to the base. Let's make that the priority over adding new dollars. But then as state budget circumstances allow, if we're able to do so, let's add dollars to that performance fund. And that's what's going to keep us moving toward that 60 by 30 goal. Now, that's a long-winded answer.
Yeah, we're going to move on and let other people ask questions.
Yeah,
That's the
I hope I
difference between
answered
asking
your
me, Jay, and
question,
asking Bill.
Yeah, you might want to ask Dr. Thompson questions instead of me. Okay.
Now, hey, Bill, I've got a question. This is Bob Jackson. So first and foremost, I personally agree. There's got to be some mechanism to add permanent money to the base. Retaining faculty, hiring new faculty, and also administrators. We all have that pressure on us today. It's a very competitive marketplace, especially those of us that are near other states that are funding higher ed differently. The question I have in regard to the model, so if no new money is put into the model, have you run through scenarios, because you're fixing you're fixing part of these monies into bases. So then there's less money in the overall pool. So if there's no new money put into it, what's it look like in year two? I know you showed the one scenario. I could not tell if there was new money added to that scenario or not.
I didn't take it out to the next year. But if there were no new dollars put back into the performance pool, then there would be no money to distribute out of that performance fund.
Well, right, but we're not fixing. Okay, I understand. We're fixing all of it basically because all of it's being fixed in some form or fashion. So if no new money is added to it, then the next year it's going to be zero distributed. So obviously investing going forward, it will be a key priority for all of us.
Yeah, and what you've done, Bob, is you basically have reset your base with a bigger recurring funding mechanism if there's no new money put in. We hope that's not the case, right? In this scenario presented, if there's no new money put in it, then in fact you will be at the base you are with no new funds. You're still at that base though, right? The recurring base that's larger in that regard.
You know, I mean,
President
just
Jackson. I'm sorry, President McFadden. President Jackson, I misspoke, and I'm trying to page forward. Heather, I'm no longer able to page up or down. Okay, there we go. I misspoke a moment ago. In this scenario, this assumes that once you've added those dollars to the base, that the fund has been refilled with the exact same amount, 97.3 million. And that's where the funding comes from in that second column from the far right.
That was really my question. I couldn't tell initially from that slide. So
yes, so you are adding the 75 million to the base of those institutions that earn those funds. And then you're assuming that the funds, the performance fund is refilled, and that again, the share for the universities would be identical in the upcoming fiscal year, 75,793,300. And that's what allows you to see that because you've now moved the institutions toward what I'll call the permanent, more permanent funding parity instead of temporary funding parity. UK and Northern receive less dollars in the distribution, and Eastern and Moorhead and Murray and Western receive a larger share of dollars. And unless we do something about KSU small school adjustment in this round of the working group's deliberations, it's probably likely that KSU over the next 3 years would not receive any kind of distribution from the performance fund.
Right.
And one other thing I want to
Yeah.
comment on, President Jackson, regarding your comments. These different scenarios are not mutually exclusive. You don't have to pick one or the other. You could say, okay, we want to allow funds to become recurring to the base, but then going forward over the next 2 years, we want to use 100% formula share to distribute the money so that everybody is guaranteed over the next 2 years of getting some funding.
right.
Or we want to carve some portion of that funding going forward out of that performance fund, take a third of it and distribute that to the base using some other method. So
Right.
you guys can talk through that and decide, which of these various approaches, you want to agree on, but they're not mutually exclusive.
Exactly. Thank you.
Yeah, let's give others a chance to jump in on this conversation. David, I saw you raise your hand.
I think Representative Tipton unmuted, so I'd be interested what he has to say.
Surely not, President McFadden. I'll chime in here as a policymaker, and I understand exactly what this proposal is intended to do. It's intended to take the earnings from the performance model, add it to the base so you can make more permanent decisions. Now, President Thompson, I assume you've got Chairman Petrie and Chairman McDaniel to sign off on this. So you're confident they're going to refill the performance funding model.
That, like I said earlier when I started this, and Bill and my team talked about this yesterday in great detail, Representative Tipton. We're obviously going to ask for it, but there's an assumption made here that we hope is correct, But no, by no means have I got them signed off to this.
I understand. I'm just going to point out a couple other things that we have to deal with. And one of them is the capital projects for university and the cost of inflation. I suspect some universities are going to come back and going to ask for some additional funds there. I know we invested in Bucks for Brains, and I'm confident you're going to want more investment in that going forward. And I think as we look at this and the expectation, higher education's got to understand what all of the asks are. And then we'll have to make policy decisions going forward based on the funds available. And I know that the budget director Hicks is on here. The March general fund revenue numbers is probably the first month in a long time that we've really had a slowdown. We've been rocking and rolling. So I think we're going to be watching to see. A lot of this is going to depend on the last quarter going into the next fiscal year, what the consensus forecast group says. And as you know, there's going to be a lot of competing factors out there for those funds that are available. So I understand what you're trying to do. If we do this, it's a possibility maybe in that first budget cycle, you don't get all the 97 million in the model. And I'm not saying I'm not for that. I'm just saying the reality is there's going to be a lot of competition for those dollars.
And I want to throw one thing in to be clear. Bill and Sean started out with the pot here. CPE thought process, Representative Tipton, be clear. We feel there should be a portion, or it could be all of it, we hope, that would go to a base. But we feel like there has to be a base increase of some sort, or we don't get where we need to go. So that's our put forth from a statewide perspective. Bill and Sean are giving you several scenarios by which that.
And like you say, let's say we took 50% of the earnings and added to the base, and then maintain that other 50% in the model. So there's a lot of options out there. I know we're just starting and having conversation now, but a lot of these decisions are ultimately going to be determined by what the budgetary decisions are.
And just for clarification, quickly, President Thompson, we were not presupposing that there would be a full 97 million necessarily to refill the pot, but that was a convenient number to utilize so that you would have 75,793,300 to compare to the distribution in the current year. And what we were trying to show with this scenario was how the distribution would change from the current year and what it would look like next year if those funds were made recurring, and if you were to distribute the same amount of funding next year that you did this year.
So I guess Representative Tipton kind of opened the door to what I wanted to address here, which was, the first 5 years of this was performance cutting. That with this investment, we are still trying to get back to a position where we had a redistribution of resources inside of the four-year university sector. I do think that Representative Tipton touched on the fact this is going to be cyclical. Revenues are going to be cyclical. We hope we're on a trajectory to grow every year for the next 30 years, but we know that, history tells us that there's going to be ups and downs. I think sustainability and stability in funding is how you can make long-term investments. And I think the notion of saying that an institution may not get new money if there's not new money, or if there's a smaller amount of money, we can't lose sight of the fact that if an institution is not losing ground, that's not a win, or that's not moving the sector forward. And so I think that stability and building stability into the institutional profile is critically important, because like a lot of state government, we're funded differently than our K-12 partners, and we're funded differently than a lot of other government sectors. And so balancing affordability and access to the student, trying to serve the faculty and staff and keep them with a living wage, all balanced with the support that we need from the state to not only educate students, but to really try to catch up on some badly needed facility improvements and the asset preservation funds, Representative Tipton, have been transformational on our campus. It doesn't look the best right now, but we are fixing a lot of things that needed to be fixed. So I think there is a lot here, but if this brings stability, I think it's a step forward.
And let me be clear, Representative Tipton, we will be, and we hope that the General Assembly is supportive of our continued ask around asset preservation and some of the other things that keeps our campuses going. But yeah, Dr. McFadden, without a doubt, we've got to offer more stability. Now, I will throw in the marker, this is Aaron Thompson, what I argued in 2016 when we were doing this. I think we have to take KSU to whole, so they have an opportunity to start earning some dollars through performance too, but that's another conversation we can have at another time. So, but anyway, we can figure that part out. Others along this conversation.
Secretary Hicks has his hand up.
Okay.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm just some thoughts, around this first item. One, I'm very sympathetic to the idea, of making the performance funds recurring, and there are two, I'll say, historical anchors that are one reason why that might be an idea. One, where we had $250 million in cuts since the Great Recession until the last couple of years where we had some funds. That was the governor's, interest in terms of putting funding into base while recognizing a good thing about performance funding model. Second is the issue that Bill has outlined for us about funding parity, in terms of dollars per FTE. If we were to put in baseline this 75 million, we've gotten much closer to kind of what that historical issue was, particularly with Northern and Western, in terms of the years of great enrollment growth that happened with both of those institutions while funding didn't follow. So those are reasons and rationale for why baselining, the current amount is a positive, right? It makes up for some past cuts. It also sets a bar of funding parity to the point that I want to throw this out as an adjunct, right? In a moving forward basis, the idea of performance funding has inherently with it the future prospect of intentional funding disparity. It's intended to create funding disparity in the future, right? And so one thought I've got is funding disparity is not all bad. We're trying to rectify historical disparity, but moving forward, right, we're having winners and less winners. And so I just want to point that out, that those two things are in contradiction to one another, but that's okay. Second, as a budget person, I'm very sensitive to the ability to identify these funds as long-term available funds, absent, future budget cuts. There's going to be another day down the road when that happens. But one of the things that's interesting, that this is like the SEEK formula, in that in year one, we're really rewarding behavior from year zero here, right? You're distributing funding based upon past outcomes, right? And that's the only way to do it. You can only do it that way. And so the funding that you get this year was based on prior year's behavior. And so that's okay, but just want to point that out. But I understand the long-term, use of this. I would be interested as a subset of this discussion down the road to find out. So how did you come up with the funding to do some of these good things, when you didn't have funding at all, right? So you redistributed resources. I've heard you all talk about at the president's, about where you devoted funding because you had to cut funding elsewhere, so that you thought that was the most strategic move in order to create these positive outcomes. The other thing that I want to think about this, not for next budget, but for every budget, right? As Representative Tipton said, fiscal situations are going to change over time. And so I'm thinking about this funding model as something that has to live within all fiscal situations. Fiscal situations where you don't have, if you were to rebase these funds, you don't have any performance funding for a possible biennium or fiscal year. So we need to think about, so how do we continue to advance these goals, right? That we want these outcomes, even in a budget where you're not going to be rewarded for it, right? So that's something to think about. Those are, and then in the current situation right now, I mean, just recognizing the inflationary costs, that are hitting everybody, right? And it's mostly, we're a labor intensive business in post-secondary education, right? We have a heavy physical plant, but a whole lot of our money goes to people. And so we know what's going on in terms of the competition for good faculty, good staff, in terms of salary and other benefits there. So I don't want to dismiss that at all, but you gotta think about, is that a trend? Is that something that you look at in a variable sense down the road rather than a sustained sense, right? Rather than guaranteeing a CPI, something like that. Do we say, let's adjust the formula for conditions that are, great, higher cost than normal, right? Rather than embedding something structurally into the formula. So those are just some thoughts that I have, President Thompson, about that first question.
Well, first of all, Secretary Hicks, you hit on so many great parts. I know we don't have time to discuss them all, but I want to hit on a couple of quick ones before we reopen it back up. One is, yes, over the previous years, we have indeed had to make significant efficiency cuts, but while at the same time, we made strategic investments. So we cut deep in some areas that we'd rather not have cut to make strategic investments to focus on. Every one of our campuses have a promised scholarship, those low-income students that they're serving. That money had to come somewhere. So we've seen a huge increase in outputs of aid, institutional aid. I mean, won't go in great detail on that, but yes. We've used the variability, though, even during that time and in time performance funding around tuition. But it just so happens that we've been very stingy with that, right? And not letting that happen. So it hasn't serviced what needs to be. The third point that I'll make that I think is crucial that everybody understands that you said, yes, those institutions that are performing and outcomes previously measured will get more money. So there is it's not just a distribution item we're talking about. There's real outcomes that money goes along with here. You're absolutely right. So if Jay Morgan and Ron Johnson and some of the other folks, Bob Jackson to a degree, or any of the others, don't have dollars to set up their infrastructure, human infrastructure, as you mentioned so clearly, to actually help those students to become successful, then we're in trouble. It just so happens, I do believe we had gotten way beyond the breaking point. And I'm not an apologist, by the way, for those who don't know me. No, I'm not. But we had gotten beyond the breaking point of where we've cut to such a degree that we've lost faculty, we're losing other people because we haven't given raises. We haven't done the things to really keep that human infrastructure moving forward. So one of the arguments that you pose is an argument we can look at. Is there a variability issue that can be placed in the model to handle some of those? I'll leave that up to Bill that we can look at, by the way. I'm not sure we would want to do that today, but I think all your points are very clear to me. The others is if you take 250 million out of a system, it will have some effect. You can't, either we had super bloat and somehow we got back to even, or you could have had some bloat that you took it out of and then cut into the muscle. I mean, all of those, and I'm sure every campus would argue that they didn't have tons of bloat, but maybe they cut that out and now they've been into the bone for a while. So I think all of those are exactly the reasons why we are proposing, looking at it from a state perspective, that we've got to start investing in some of the base in order to build the baseline back. But we also have to give our institutions that are smaller an opportunity to compete, or that funding disparity even grows larger and larger. That's my speech, and I'll shut up. Other presidents or other people want to interact here. I see, Tim, you came off.
Yeah, Aaron, I agree with the ability to have consistency and recurring dollars, and would also be in favor of the performance funds being made recurring. I would wonder if we consider not just the funds as they are today, but if we would make that a recurring practice, because what looking back does is the performance funding dollars that we got, because we didn't know they were going to be put into base, we couldn't use them for recurring costs. Maybe we could now, but if we knew they were, if we knew we were going to go through the same process going forward, when we got our performance funding allocation, we would know that that is cemented. And so we could use that in a different way as soon as it was allocated, instead of waiting for the next decision to bring it to base. That was the only point I had there. And then I'll move us along a little bit to the second point, which is I also appreciate taking some portion of that new allocation outside of the model. I don't think it should be a dollar amount across the board. I do think it should be a percentage, and I look forward to that conversation as well.
Thank you, Tim. Others on this? I know we have to get to KCTCS here in a second, but I want to make sure we save enough time for any input. How many of you disagree with putting at least a portion of the performance earned funds to the base?
Aaron, I want to clarify maybe a vote for Morehead State there. Our first preference would be distributing 1/3 of the money outside the model just for inflationary purposes, or some percentage. And then as a secondary vote, supporting and secondary measure something to the base. And I think you understand maybe my reasons in making that comment.
I understand, absolutely. Any other directed comments? And Representative Tipton, I know Senator Givens is not on here, and you know, outside of this conversation, happy to discuss with whomever we need to discuss with in the House and the Senate some even more detail around this, and Secretary Hicks, Governor's office, same way. Anyway, Bill, what else do we have on this before we head to the KCTCS piece?
Well, we actually have 30 more minutes before we need to turn it over to KCTCS. They said they only needed the last 10 or 15 minutes of the program.
Okay.
So I would like to use President Morgan's comments as a segue and remind people that what his comments mirror what I said earlier. These items are not mutually exclusive. You could put some earned funds to the base or all earned funds to the base, and you could also choose in the next round of funding to say that you're going to take some portion or some percentage of the performance fund and allocate that outside the base. And that's the next question. Do work group members support the idea of using a portion of the performance funds to provide base allocations outside the model? And we've got two options, one submitted by Morehead and one submitted by Murray. And let's see. This was the first one, and this was shared with the working group at our last meeting. And it's basically providing a 5% of the adjusted net general fund base allocation outside the model to every institution. And then you distribute the residual or the remaining performance funds using the existing model. And what is the impact of that? It would allow every institution to receive at least 5% of its adjusted net general fund to address inflationary cost increases every year. And so if that were written into the statute, we would have taken $97 million, this year. And once we apply that 5% of the adjusted net general fund base across the board increase, we would deduct that from the 97 million, and then we would distribute the remainder using the existing model. It would allow changes in outcomes and funding disparities that developed over time to be addressed through that residual distribution. So it would not preclude providing those financial incentives that we wanted to embed in the performance funding model to produce those additional outcomes And that residual piece, the roughly 2/3 of the funds that remain would continue to work as intended in the funding model. So here's the scenario 6, showing that 5% across the board base increase. The first column of numbers is the baseline distribution. That second column of numbers highlighted in pink is the adjusted general fund for this upcoming year, 2023-24. And if you take a 5% across the board percentage of that for each institution, you can see the across the board and what we're calling the across the board inflation allocation, which totals $29.2 million. So you would take that $29.2 million out of the $75.8 million total available funds and distribute it using that distribution you see in that fourth column of numbers, the across the board allocation. That would leave you $46.6 million to distribute using the existing funding model. And we ran the model to show what that would look like. And then if you add the across the board allocation to the existing model residual calculation, you see the hypothetical 23-24 distribution in the second column from the right. And so that has the effect of, reducing the amount that UK would have received by about $1.1 million. It reduces the amount for U of L and Eastern and Murray and Northern and Western. And it benefits KSU and Moorhead by giving them some additional dollars.
Bill, Dr. Johnson has his hand up.
Yes. So that's the scenario that was suggested by Murray. And I'm going to turn it back over to President Thompson.
Dr. Johnson, did you have your hands up?
Yes, I did. For one, I think that it's important that once this is done, Representative Tipton's point has got to be taken into account in terms of the total requests, because it's just, you're just doing one side. You're going to actually expose yourself to challenges. But the other piece that I think is important, when I look at a budget, like a university budget, I look at what I call controllable and non-controllable, especially for an institution like Kentucky State University. The non-controllable expenses add up to, of the current budget, it's almost 50%. So I'm not sure across the other institutions that this model doesn't take into account that you have banner that has a cost. And if you're going to be in the university, you have to have banner. Actually, your tenured faculty are actually a non-controllable cost because you have essentially a fixed annuity associated with them. So in addition to doing this exercise, it'd be very, very useful to really get a better understanding, because two institutions that actually have the same cost per student or revenue per student could actually be in really different situations. And that differential is not what this model is supposed to be designed for. The differential should only be a performance differential. And so if I have a long-term contract with for my banner services and banner's prices are going up, but the other guy next to me, their service costs are going up right now, it creates a host of problems that then turn out to be performance issues. So I just think that the Representative Tipton point that you got to look at the whole piece. That at this point, set this up, but then know you're going to have to come back to it after you look at these other issues to make the kind of adjustments so it fits.
Other statements?
President Thompson, I do have a question. Using this 5% base allocation, of course, I understand what it's doing. It's actually helping our small schools. And I know you all had a discussion about increasing the small school adjustment. What's the comparison of this model to increasing the small school adjustment?
I think that's exactly the right question in this case. Bill, I'll let you jump in there because you definitely have a definition.
it is exactly the right question, Representative Tipton. And as I said earlier, they're not mutually exclusive. You could do this exact scenario, but also increase the small school adjustment for Morehead State University and Kentucky State University. And in that third column from the right, where it says distribute the existing a remainder with the existing model, instead of having zeros in that column for KSU and Morehead, there would be dollars that would be distributed to KSU and Morehead, because you now have brought them up to par or funding parity through those larger small school adjustments. And I have run that model separate with just the small school adjustment. It's not included in this packet that we have for you today. But we can certainly include that in materials for our next meeting. So I've run a scenario that looks at what if that were the only change, where we have the larger small school adjustment for Morehead and for KSU. What would be the impact of that? And what I'll do is run one additional scenario, which is the scenario 6 that you see right here, plus the addition of the small school adjustment increases for Morehead and KSU. And I'll do that and have it ready by our next meeting.
I will say this, Representative Tipton, back when we were doing this model in the beginning, some may remember who were around, I argued for a much larger small school adjustment for KSU and Morehead. I don't know if I had a lot of buy-in at that time, but it clearly looks to me, at least from my vantage point, that it made sense then and it still makes sense now. So anyway, I'll just add that parenthetically.
On the other side of that coin, not applying a small school adjustment to a large institution would put more distributable funds into the model. Now, where they would find themselves in the model, I don't know, Bill, but it would put more allocable funds available to go into the model that would likely make their way to smaller schools.
And I actually do know what the impact of that would be. I just haven't shared it with anyone yet.
Yeah, I'll dovetail on what David said. I said all along that everyone should have a chance to win and compete in this. And I think that sticking with the performance funding model as a way to allocate resources. I appreciate the need for a small school adjustment, but what about the medium-sized school adjustment? Because my per FTE is less than what some others are getting. And so I want to be really careful. I appreciate equity and trying to make sure folks have what they need. And at the same time, we're talking about distributing resources based upon performance. And I think we have to balance those things.
The one point that I'll make with that conversation that Dr. McFadden and Dr. Caboni made, we have several scenarios by which, do you do them all? I'm not sure, right? But there is a way to think about a way to get parity, or think about a way to truly have people be able to compete that mitigates itself 2 or 3 years down the road. But there's also a way to think about getting funding to the base, whether it's outside allocation or an inside distribution with the performance dollars. So, but I guess I want to walk away today with several things fairly clear before we get to the end of any of these discussions. One is at least an agreed upon that we would work toward looking at ways to get some money to the base for at least a steady way of thinking about budgeting and really growing the output that we've already created this past several years. Number two, I think it is then important that we try to mitigate hurt while we're trying to increase exactly what the performance funding model stood for, and that is to those who are getting the outcomes that the state has asked for truly gets paid for doing that. So, I mean, and that Secretary Hicks will truly create even at least a disparity in the dollars going to the institutions, no doubt. So I don't think ever we're saying that we want to create purely a shares model again. That's not, we've moved away from that, and that's long dead. So today, I hope we at least will get to some of those direct answers that we are asking the questions about today. So when the next time we come, we'll have at least some of that answered.
Aaron, if I could add this from Murray State's seat, and I think in talking with many of my colleagues, this is the case as well. Whether we do part, some, all, fixing a component for predictability purposes to the base funding is key. And it seems like everyone is talking in that same vein. That is key to running each of our institutions. The percentage scenario we just looked at, or the fixed dollar amount we're looking at, and Bill, the fixed dollar amount is what Murray State suggested, is something I called it open the doors money. These are just scenarios of fixing part of that, whether it's $3 or $3 million for every institution, $4 million for every institution, a percentage for every institution, or what you've earned for every institution. I don't know what any of these, other than the ones that you've shown, look like from the standpoint of what the next round is, and future investing is key by the General Assembly into this model. But it sounds like we all agree with fixing part of this, Aaron, to the base.
I would agree with that. I've been fairly quiet through this because NKU has performed well in the model, and we would like to continue to do so. But again, without that some reassurance of something permanent to the base, not sure how sustainable that is. I like to say we've been punching above our weight, and we think we could do that. But imagine what we could do if we had more reliability that this was coming. We could prepare and be better support those low-income students that we know are critical for this state. But without knowing what's coming, it's a challenge. So I agree with that base, and curious to continue this discussion about outside of the base, the 5% extra. I think that's an interesting discussion.
Hey, Bill, let's move to the next one.
Okay, and President Jackson just mentioned the $3 million fixed base allocation. That was something that Murray State proposed, I want to say about a week ago, and we ran the scenario, and most of you, this was not provided at our previous meeting, so this is new. You will note in that second bullet there, rather than distributing the residual using the existing model, their suggestion was use formula share to distribute that residual. So what would the impact of that be? Of course, it would allow each institution to receive a $3 million base to address inflationary cost increases. Although changes in outcomes would be reflected in those formula share percentages going forward over time. Those formula share percentages would change, not very much, but they would change some as you move forward in time. But funding disparities could begin to creep in and grow over time because you're not using the existing model any longer. You're distributing funds using formula share. So here's this scenario number 7. And as I said, you haven't seen this before, but column A, again, is that baseline. It's the current year distribution of the 75.8 million. That second column of numbers shows every institution would receive a $3 million fixed base allocation. And in talking with the chief budget officer, Jackie Dudley at Murray, the thinking here was that this fixed allocation would help some of our smaller institutions like KSU and Moorhead and Murray. And it indeed does that, as you'll see in a moment. So you take $24 million out of the $75.8 million pool. And then what we're doing in those next 3 columns, starting with the shaded column in blue, we calculate the fiscal 23-24 formula totals. That's the far right column in table 3 of the performance funding model. Then you do a percent of total of that 527.8 million. That's included in that formula total distribution, and you calculate each institution's formula share. So UK has a 33.3% share according to the model, and that formula share, by the way, is how the model would distribute the funding if every institution was at true funding parity. So that list of percentages is the share of funding at funding parity. So if you use those percentages to distribute the $51.8 million that remains, and then add that back to the fixed base allocation, you get column B, which is a hypothetical 2023-24 distribution. And you can see that UK, instead of getting like the $30.9 million in the current year, would receive a $20.2 million distribution. Instead of 17.5 million at U of L, they would get 14.4 million.
Bill, what is the total on that blue column? I don't recognize that total. The 527, that's different than any total you've been showing.
If you run the funding model, and we ran it for 23-24 under the assumption that there's no changes in performance. And so the only thing that's changing is the scenario itself, where you're taking that fixed base allocation out and then you're distributing the remaining 51.8. But those formula totals are calculated every time you run the model, and it's in table 3. It's about halfway through the model. And it's basically saying, okay, we know how the funding is currently distributed based on what every institution is producing for every single metric that's utilized in the model. What would be a true fair distribution of funds, that the model would determine? And it's actually shaded in blue in table 3. And I can bring that up and show it to you.
Yeah, and I'm just asking, that number is 56 million less than the other numbers you've been showing us. It's 527 instead of 583.
Yes. And
Explain.
that's
So that's what I don't understand.
Yeah, the adjusted net general fund, then you back out the small school adjustment, and that's why that number is less. So what you actually run.
All right, you next time, please footnote that so we can understand it.
Okay, we'll do, sir. At any rate, you get the distribution of the 51.8 million. And when you add the fixed base allocation to that number, you get the numbers in column B. And then if you take column B minus column A, it's basically shifting money away from UK, U of L, and Northern, but toward every other institution. And you can see that KSU now would receive a $3.6 million distribution of that 75.8 million total. Moorhead would receive, 5.6 million, Murray 3.1 million, et cetera, above what they received in the current year.
So Bill, wouldn't that undo the parity that you all did for NKU?
Well, that's what I said a minute ago, that unfortunately, because you're no longer using the existing model, you look at that last bullet on this slide, funding disparities can grow over time. So the answer to your question is yes.
I think Secretary Hicks hit on this. Funding disparity will happen over time. It is not, it's inevitable. It's designed.
It is. Yeah, every time, but because this model is taking into account changes in enrollment, changes in program mix, changes in degrees produced. And so you're going to have, every time you run the model with a new set of data, it's going to move in the direction of less parity. But State Budget Director Hicks was correct that over the first 4 or 5 years, there was so little funding provided for the funding model that we never really have gotten to the place where we have addressed those historical disparities, and some of those were very large. And if you were to address those, then moving forward, the funding disparities that occur from year to year would be very incremental. So comments about this particular proposal, and we've got about 7 minutes.
Thoughts, folks?
Okay, hearing none, I'm going to move on to the last.
Bill, let me throw one item in. A lot of you may need to think about this in great detail. I would ask that you get hold of Bill and Sean if there's really sort of statements. Most of you have seen these before, I know, especially chief budget officers, but still, if you can't think of what you need to think about right now, we want to hear, because we want to start whittling down some of these options, right? As time goes along, not to keep them all on the table all the time. So anyway, thanks, Bill. Go ahead.
This scenario was shared at our last meeting. It's something else that was proposed by Murray State 3 years ago. But in recent conversations with Jackie Dudley, their chief budget officer, Murray State would still be interested in this, and talking with Mary Pfister at Moorhead. Moorhead has indicated that they would be interested in this approach as well. And again, it's an approach that could be combined with something else. Like you could reset the funding floor by making earned funds recurring. And then over the next 2 years, you could say, we're going to use formula share to distribute funding, 100% of available funds. And that is going to guarantee that every institution, regardless of changes in outcomes, regardless of hold harmless allocations, regardless of any kind of historical funding disparities, every institution would receive funding. But again, funding disparities could grow over time using that approach. But at any rate, here is that scenario. And again, State Budget Director Hicks, this is using column D and table 3 of the performance funding model highlighted in blue to calculate those formula share percentages. And then it's applying it to the full amount of funding, the $75.8 million. For some reason, my total lines are being cut off, but at any rate, you can see the difference that makes in the distribution. And KSU would receive $915,000. Moorhead would receive $3.8 million. And it's primarily reducing the amount of funding that would be received by UK, U of L to a lesser extent, but reducing the amount of funding that Northern receives. Now, you haven't addressed that historical disparity between Northern and the other comprehensive universities. But if you were to combine this approach with the making the funds recurring approach, that would resolve that issue. So at any rate, comments about this approach?
Bill, I want to ask a question before we get into KCTCS, maybe for next meeting. And my question is about mandated programs. Those budget appropriations have been the same for many years. I would be interested in seeing what the actual cost to perform those mandated programs are compared to what the appropriations are. Or are we putting more money in than it's taken to operate? Are we putting less money in? And it's just a question that I had thought of recently. We can get some information on that.
Yeah, Representative Tipton, and I would add, let's look at all fund sources for those mandated programs.
And I would say that off the top of my head, I know at UK for a number of their land grant related programs, they're putting in much more money than what is required in terms of the federal match, and a lot more money than they've received from the state. But we've got Angie Martin on the call, and I'll let her respond to that.
Yes, with regard to our land grant funds, you are right, Bill. We do match more than required on the federal. A lot of that, though, is for the extension and the experiment station as approved by the General Assembly. So I think overall, our programs on mandated, we spend at a minimum what has been budgeted through the General Assembly. Some of our programs, a lot of our programs do cost more to operate.
We can get that feedback though for both of you. And John, I just want to make sure I heard what you said. You're saying all fund sources to make those mandated programs work.
I just know that some of these have other funding sources. So I wanted to make sure that the information included each funding source.
Gotcha. Sean and Bill, Sean, I know you're on here. I don't see your face, but I know you are. Let's get that down and get that information from the campuses for him.
Yes, sir.
I'll get that.
Okay, any other questions or comments? And we've got one more scenario that we're not going to go through, and that was using a formula share approach for a third of the funding and then using the existing model for the remainder. You guys saw this scenario at the last meeting. We're not going to have time to discuss it here today, but I want to give any president or other work group member a chance to make any other comments or ask any questions before we turn it over to KCTCS.
Bill, just 1 minute, where just tell us exactly what that is saying.
Okay, what this is saying is rather than distributing 100% of the available funding using formula share, what would it look like if in statute, the performance funding statute said whatever the available funds are in the performance fund, take 1/3 of those funds and distribute those based on the formula share calculated in table 3, column D of the performance funding model, which is you're distributing $25.3 million according to what that distribution would look like if you were at true funding parity. Then you take the other 50.5 million, assuming that you've got the same amount of funding in the performance pool, which we do have in the upcoming year, and you would distribute those funds using the existing model. Now, the advantage of that is, as I said on the previous slide, it would allow every institution to receive some share of funding, regardless of changes in outcomes, regardless of hold harmless allocations, regardless of any changes in performance. And regardless of any historical funding disparities. But it would have the advantage through the residual distribution of reflecting changes in outcomes and funding disparities that develop over time going forward. So with 2/3 of the funding still being distributed using the existing model, you would continue to address any historical funding disparities or any new disparities that might come up going forward. And as you can see, Moorhead in this instance would have received about $1.3 million in the upcoming year, KSU 300,000, and it takes just incrementally a small amount from every other institution in terms of what they would have earned.
And we'll leave it there. The reason why I wanted to say this, y'all may remember, some of you, I know the presidents do, know that this was the idea that I proposed about 1.5 years, 2 years ago. At that time, this is not sacrosanct in my mind by no means, but this was one of the original thoughts we had, or I'll say Aaron Thompson had, I won't say everybody else. And I'm not saying that this is where I'm wedded to or where I am, but I just wanted to point out that this was a conversation, Dr. Jackson, you may remember us having a while back with the presidents a couple of times. So anyway, Bill, thank you for going over that.
Aaron, one last thing before we move into KCTCS. I think that it's worth saying for everyone, there are disparities in this model, and Bill, I think you would agree exactly with what I'm going to say. Every day, every semester, every year, however you want to look at it, there's disparities that occur based on enrollment, tuition changes, fee changes. I mean, the list goes on and on. So there's no perfect system here to say there's pure parity across the board with any of these scenarios, because there's some disparity in this thing at every moment.
You're completely correct.
That's correct.
But the one caveat to that I would add is that we're still, because of the lack of funding for the first 5 years of implementing this model, we still have some relatively large funding disparities that are historical.
Sure.
Never been able to be addressed. And that's why CPE staff supports that notion of making the earned funds this biennium recurring to the base, because then you're close enough to true funding parity at that point,
right,
that you could almost declare victory. And as you move forward, you could use one of these other alternative methods. And changes in disparities over time, it should be, like I say, very minimal or incremental at that point.
And that's true. And lastly, when we calculate into this entire formula, more arbitrary functions, and I don't mean that in a negative way, small school adjustments for everyone, as an example, really starts distorting the entire model. And then giving back a small school adjustment to an institution or two really changes the model from the standpoint of a pure parity.
You know, Bob, let me just build on that for a second. I mean, Bill, I think there's a million scenarios. Like, there are so many things that we could put in front of you and your team to try to massage what I think is a deep philosophical discussion about what is it we're trying to achieve and how is it we can best achieve it. And I guess I struggle sometimes looking at all the models, sometimes not understanding if there's consensus about what we're trying to fix or what we're trying to do, because trying to create a system that is equal in a set of factors and institutions that are inherently unequal. I mean, we've never been equal. And so I don't know, I think it may be an impossible task. So I think that maybe trying to build some focus around philosophically what we want to achieve, and a few of these achieve some things that are very distinguishable as it relates to the particularly small schools. But I think that there's, and I know that there's more to do here, but I kind of worry we're in a spin cycle. So,
well, Dr. McFadden, let me just say, we've got to stop taking many scenarios and bring them to you all every time. I get that. We're going to have to get down to some really nitty gritty about what are the accomplishments that we can move forward with this time around that gets accomplished what we need to. And I started the conversation off this way, and I won't give any more speeches other than to say that we've got to continue the outputs that we've been able to do, but we've got to get more money to the base to help you all establish a.
That's key.
That's key. Those two things, I have to tell you, philosophically, is where I am, right? And that means that we have to build the base for some of our schools that's not received the money, Jay Morgan and Ron Johnson, some of those. So we can't leave you all behind in that conversation. But I do believe that sooner or later, there's going to be a whole lot of input from all of you with your, and believe me, I have my own wish list of things I'd love to accomplish. And I will just leave you one other thing. I'll argue vehemently that looking at the statewide needs, I'll argue for an adult learner metric. I may argue for everything else that I want, but I'll do that, right? But I'll also argue heavily that you got to get some money to the base to help you all build this pipeline that we need to build. So I think if I hear you saying what I think I hear you saying, Dr. McFadden, all of us are going to have to give up something here to accomplish the greater need of what we're trying to accomplish.
yeah, and I think expansion of this and growing this in a time when it appears there's not enough to even fill the bucket that's already here may be a tall task, to be adding more things when there's not enough to even fill what's here to begin with. And so I think we're thinning those dollars already a lot. So no, you're right. I think the focus on low income, the focus on adult learners, there's a lot of things that need more focus, but I just don't know that there's more money to do it with. And I think Representative Tipton kind of nodded his head to that. And I think Secretary Hicks indicated that he's seen the ebb and flow of how these budgets work, and that there's going to be lean times and hopefully there's going to be good times. But so.
President Thompson, with your permission, and if Brendan Lahane is on the phone, I'd like to turn it over to KCTCS. They said they needed about 10 minutes.
Sure.
Brendan, are you on the line?
I am. Can you hear me, Bill?
Yes, sir.
Okay. I'll be brief. We've just got a few slides. We just wanted to go over some of the recommended changes that we collected from our college presidents and college business officers. We did this a while back and did a survey out to our college business officers and talked it through with our college presidents. A lot of the feedback we got just echoes exactly what was talked about in length with the university model, putting money into the college's base, making the funds earned recurring so that they can be invested in programs and used for the development of programs and high cost needs and the workforce needs. There was also needs for allowing the model to distribute to more of the colleges. If moving funds into the college's base would allow us to get closer to parity and allow more colleges to earn some of the performance funding that's put in the model. Within the model itself, some of the changes that came out of our survey was using a 3-year average on all metrics except for the square footage in order to smooth some of the volatility. Again, allow earned funds to become a part of an institution's base was a big one. Some of the colleges wanted to promote equity by accounting for regional differences. Our institutional research and folks came up with a measurement that would look at community needs index that considers local unemployment, labor force participation, and poverty rates. We've looked at some different methods on implementing that community needs index. We can go to the next slide. And then we wanted to adjust some of the weights of the metrics, reducing the weighting of the progression metrics from 12 to 7% to reflect the shorter time of retention at KCTCS student as they complete short-term credentials. And then we had some overlap with our STEM plus H, high wage, high demand, and targeted industry credentials. We wanted to merge those into an overall credential calculation, and then reduce the weights of the credential metric from 15 to 8% and allow URM, underprepared, low income, and transfer students. So this just adjusts a little bit of the weighting. As Dr. Thompson said, there was a high focus on adding a adult learner metric into the model, and then also possibly add a metric that compares college's current year performance to its previous year performance to incentivize and allow all colleges to potentially receive a performance distribution. That was something that was added on. That is something that also could be, if we move to a model where these funds become into part of a college's base as we move to parity, it would allow all of our colleges to start earning some of that performance funding.
So I'm going to allow others to ask questions, Brendan, but I've got one right off the bat.
Okay.
My assumption is that for most of these recommendations, you've already kind of gotten a consensus from the 16 community and technical college presidents, but I'm assuming that with the term or the word possibly on that third bullet, that's something that's still being discussed. Is that correct?
Buddy could probably talk a little bit more about that, but there's been kind of some talk from 1 or 2 presidents on the possibility of just wanting to look further into it. So we've shown the college presidents a few different models. The majority were supportive of all these, but the possibility ones are the ones that we've had some additional questions on.
And have you and Buddy begun to run any scenarios or done any modeling to show how these various recommendations would impact funding to your various campuses?
Yeah, we did this. It's been a while since we did this. We were looking at this all, I believe, in the fall, looking maybe summer, fall last year. Ran through some of these scenarios with the different models, and we actually looked at it. Before that, we looked at it a couple of years ago when we did an evaluation of our model, and some of these were incorporated in those model scenarios also.
President Thompson, State Budget Director Hicks, others, any questions, comments?
Yeah, Bill, I've got one question. I wanted Brendan, on the second slide where you're reducing the weighting of 2 different current metrics, that would increase the weighting for what?
Alicia, are you on there? Do you remember how the weighting was broken down?
You're on mute. Alicia, you're still muted.
So we can get you that information.
But Secretary Hicks, you bring this up, and I think it should be looked at. Let me just throw this in. We've talked about it previously, but there's some items, as we'll get to fairly soon in one of our meetings, that we may need to take a look at. We no longer need in that respect, right? You know, for me, it's the square footage one that we need to discuss heavily. And what does that mean? And then we took that away. What can we allocate that percentage to, or whatever? I mean, there's all kinds of things we need to talk about. So I'd be interested. Looks like Alicia's ready, can talk now.
Laptop. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, great. So the idea is to reduce the progression weight as well as the weight on the credentials that are tied to the economy, to give more weight to those credentials that are for traditionally underserved populations. So to increase the weight on URM credentials, underprepared credentials, low income credentials, increase the weight that we give to students who transfer onto four-year institutions, as well as to add that adult credentials metric.
And I assume that you have, you know, certain goals or objectives that you want to achieve by reducing the weighting of some metrics and increasing it for others, correct?
That is correct.
Let me ask you one quick question. I know we're out of time. What does your adult metric look like?
So we are looking at the number of credentials awarded to adults that are 25 plus.
Okay, so you're using the age category. Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Other questions?
President Thompson, I had a quick question. Back in the 2022 session, had a lot of conversation with a Representative Gibbons Prunty about some of the colleges in the system, particularly those in the coal communities. There were some concerns about some disparities in funding. That would you're possibly talking about the regional differences, would that take into account some of those issues that such particular communities might have and colleges have? Would that be part of that conversation?
Yes, that would be part of the conversation. So when you look at that community needs index and bring in that labor force participation, the poverty rates, as well as the unemployment rates, that really does impact Southeastern Kentucky in particular, and some parts of Western Kentucky, which are also impacted by coal.
President Thompson, we're about a minute over, but just quickly, one last slide in terms of next steps. We are very close to being able to run the performance distribution for the upcoming fiscal year 2023-24. We just got the sign off from the campus IR directors and Travis Muncie from our data and advanced analytics shop this past Thursday that the data has been validated for most of our metrics. We're still finalizing square foot data for one or two institutions, and we're trying to nail down some instruction and student services expense numbers for KSU for 1 year because we don't have their audited financial statements. But once we do that, which we should be able to do here in the next day or two, we're going to be sending out what we call the preliminary run of the 2023-24 performance funding model and ask our CBOs to double check all of our calculations so that we can meet that May 1st deadline to notify State Budget Director Hicks how the funds, the 97.5 million or so in the performance fund should be distributed for this upcoming academic year. So we're going to obviously run the model, complete that validation process with the CBOs. We will analyze those results and bring that back to the working group at our next meeting. Other than that, we're going to continue to run scenarios as needed in terms of the university model. And we're going to continue these discussions like we had today and hopefully begin to reach consensus on some of these proposed changes. We will also be doing that same thing within the CBO group. And if anything comes out of those discussions with the CBOs, and I know you'll be doing the same, President Thompson, with your group of presidents, hopefully we can make some headway in those two arenas before we come back, to this working group and maybe have some more concrete proposals to consider. In terms of KCTCS, I would like to see, some of the scenarios or the modeling of how some of their suggested changes are going to impact funding for their 16 campuses. And we'll continue to have the discussion and reach consensus on their proposed changes. And that's everything that we had for today, President Thompson. So I'll throw it back out to you and the rest of the group for any closing thoughts, final comments, whatever.
Thanks, Bill. Good job. First of all, Bill, we want to thank you for your work, your and Sean's work in putting all this stuff together. They work on this stuff a whole lot, folks. I don't know if you can tell. A couple points you made that I guess I want to reiterate and then take any statements or questions before we quickly adjourn. One is, I know we need, as I said earlier, to start whittling this down to some bite-sized pieces as we go into the summer to get some conclusions that we can then put forth to the General Assembly. So I will ask you all to diligently, once again, think about what we've said. We'll take into account what you've said today, but we want to not, between now and next time, we don't want to be idle. So please give us the kind of feedback you need to give us for us to bring stuff back for, once again, good decisions. The last item that I will say is, as we go into this fall, Representative Tipton will be ready, and Secretary Higgs, to present you all with a budget that we think kind of helps higher education to move forward this next time out. It will be more than just the performance funding, without a doubt. But I would also like for all you folk who are on here to think about, exactly what are the areas that we need to consider in the model that kind of moves us forward, even in addition to the other dollars we'll get, hopefully, in asset preservation and so on. But what would the model look like in the future to kind of move the state forward? I appreciate your time. Any last questions or thoughts before we let you get in the sunshine? Thank you very much. Have a great rest of this day and week. Talk to you soon.